Aidan Roberts has made ascents of his two long-term projects, the Helvellyn Project up in the Lake District, which he's since named Spots of Time, and the Midnight Project in Chironico, Switzerland. Now, given that these are long-term projects for Aidan, and that Aidan makes short-term projects of most people's long-term projects, these are going to be pretty hard. But the question is, how hard? But there's a catch, and that is that we don't actually know how hard they are, because Aidan himself hasn't offered or proposed a grade. He's instead chosen to focus on the experience of climbing the problems themselves, and to that end, it feels like we're cheapening it a little by talking about grades. But we always talk about grades, and even though people say they don't like grades, they love grades. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of that, let's talk about each project in turn, starting off with the Helvellyn Project. Spots of Time features small, relatively flat holds which require quick movements and good contact strength to get between. Now, this differs from Aidan's typical style of climbing, which involves slower movements between more secure positions. Speaking about the project on the Wedge YouTube channel, Aidan had this to say: "It's flipping amazing. It's really hard. Like really hard. It's really crimpy, and you can't just rely on that alone. There's a lot to coordinate. It's got hard heel hooks. It's a very complex boulder problem." And on his own Careless Talk podcast, he had this to say: "It's hard to know exactly how well it suits me. It's kind of like a nice bit of variation in my style. You can't just solely static crimp the whole time." Having been searching for a project in Europe, Aidan found the boulder in May 2023, just a stone's throw from his home in the Lake District. As such, the boulder represented an opportunity for Aidan to spend some time at home after a long time travelling. And also a hard project to work on and train up for, and something that would allow Aidan to maintain motivation throughout one of the wettest and most miserable winters on record here in the UK. Using the rare dry days to try the project and the many wet days to train, Aidan described finding a harmonious balance in between projecting and training. Aidan spent roughly 30 days on Spots of Time, but started investing proper time and effort into it from February. He worked it mostly by himself and spent 10 days dialing down the finishing sequence that he ended up using on his successful ascent. Speaking on his Careless Talk podcast, Aidan had this to say: "In terms of the things I've done in climbing, I think it's the experience I'm most proud of, and I feel like it's really special to have found it so close to my home." So while Spots of Time required Aidan to move away from his preferred style, the Midnight Project demanded him to actually improve on what are considered to be his strengths, and that is controlled movements in stable positions on tiny edges. He also added that this boulder offered a style that hasn't actually been represented within most modern bouldering. The small edge is very much a product of the 90s and early 2000s, where it was all about the crimp. But things have changed in recent times, so this is bringing it back, but at a level that has never really been seen before. Midnight follows what Aidan describes as a series of very narrow gas bubbles. And I'm not sure what that means, but it sounds amazing. And it does so up a really finger-intensive 30-degree wall. Aidan was introduced to the project back in 2022, in and around the time he climbed Sean Rabout's Font 9A Alphane. After successfully completing Alphane, he prioritised the Midnight Project as one to work towards. In the spring of 2023, Aidan returned for an extended trip to Switzerland with the sole intention of climbing the Midnight Project. He made good progress on the boulder, dropping one of the final easier moves, and describing the effort that he had made as one of the hardest he had ever done. And that is something we're going to come back to later, because it is a statement as to the difficulty of this particular project and what Helvellyn Project must have taken him with 30 days of effort. He returned with Sean Rabout in the autumn with a more relaxed approach and lower expectations. As a result of this, the 5 or so sessions he had were far more enjoyable, and he got back from that eager to train, get stronger, and get the project done the following year. He returned in March and completed the project. And the interesting thing is is that where with Alphane and Spots of Time, he said that the final attempt, the successful ascent, was relatively effortless. On the Midnight Project, he found himself totally at his physical limit. So when it comes to how difficult these are, what are we talking? Now, when these two projects were featured within the wedge climbing video, they were proposed as two 9A projects, V17 projects. Now, looking at how long Aidan has spent on each, 30 sessions on the Helvellyn Project, Spots of Time, and also how difficult he's suggesting that the Midnight Project is. He's described it as probably the hardest he's tried whilst climbing. There doesn't seem to be much chance of these being easier than that, given Aidan's form, and the fact that he made relatively light work of Alphane again suggests that these are going to be in and around the region of Font 9A. The intriguing question for me actually is whether or not the Midnight Project in particular could be harder, because you've got to remember that that is a project that actually suited Aidan's climbing styles. He actually had to get stronger within his strengths just to climb this. And his strengths are unique in that department. But it is worth remembering that Aidan didn't want to focus on the grades, and it's potentially a little unfair that we have, especially from our armchairs, having never tried and will never try either of these two projects. But it will be interesting to see if anyone gets on them. Will Bosey will be a logical candidate for the Helvellyn Project. The Midnight Project, it will be interesting to see. Aidan is currently out in Finland where he is trying Burden of Dreams, potentially the benchmark Font 9A globally. Before we sign off, it's worth just acknowledging how exciting a time this is in British climbing, with Aidan climbing things like Spots of Time and the Midnight Project, and Will Bosey, well, kind of climbing everything else. And the two completely different styles that they operate by, with Aidan taking his time over announcing things that he's climbed, and Will, on the other hand, inviting you into the living room, live streaming from the crag. It's really nice to have those two differing approaches, and what a time for British bouldering.